Story 2. The Cabin Door That Wouldn't Lock. I was caught in the mountains when the storm hit. A sudden, unforgiving downpour that turned the trail to thick mud and twisted the wind into a howl that seemed alive. I had been hiking all morning, following a narrow ridge that dipped into a remote hollow I'd never planned to visit, and by the time the clouds rolled in, I was soaked through, chilled to the bone, and desperately looking for shelter. That's when I saw it. A cabin, small and squatting low in the hollow, the kind of place you pass by in daydreams of old Appalachia, forgotten and half swallowed by the forest. Its windows were sealed with boards, and the wood was dark and rotten, smelling of years of rain and decay. I stumbled to the door, hoping to find a handle that still worked, only to discover that the lock was old, rusted, and refused to turn no matter how hard I pushed and twisted. The rain fell harder, spattering against the boards and pooling in the low spots around the cabin, and I had no choice but to try to force my way inside. Eventually, with a groan of metal and splintered wood, the door gave just enough for me to squeeze into the cabin's gloom. The air inside was heavy, damp, and smelled of mold and old smoke, like the echoes of lives that hadn't passed through in decades. I dropped my pack, shivering, and tried to calm myself, telling myself I'd just ride out the storm here. But as I moved toward what looked like the remnants of a fireplace, I heard it, a faint knock from the other side of the door. Slow, deliberate, measured. I froze, thinking it must be the storm, a branch knocking against the cabin, maybe some animal outside. But the rhythm didn't match the rain. It was something else, something patient. I pressed my palm against the cold, warped wood, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then came another sound. Breathing. Slow, deep, uneven, coming from just beyond the wall. I could feel the vibration in the air, feel it settle around me. My stomach turned and I tried to leave, but the mud outside was thick and treacherous, sucking at my boots, forcing me back into the cabin like I'd stumbled into a trap I couldn't escape. The night stretched endlessly. Every knock on the door, every scrape against the boards, made my heart hammer in my chest. I moved closer to the window, peering out through the cracks in the boards, hoping to glimpse some rational explanation, but the hollow was shrouded in darkness and rain. The forest beyond seemed alive, bending and shifting in ways that made my mind reel. I kept telling myself that morning would come, that sunlight would dissolve this weight pressing against my chest. But hours crawled by in a blur of rain, shadow, and that terrible sense of something just outside my reach. Every time I moved, I thought I saw shapes in the darkness, watching, lingering near the edges of the hollow. The knocks became more frequent, more deliberate, and the breathing grew heavier, almost measured, as if the presence knew I was listening, waiting to see what I would do next. I pressed myself against the window, hands trembling, eyes straining through the limited light, wishing desperately for dawn. Somewhere around midnight, I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision, a flicker of shadow sliding along the perimeter of the cabin. I turned toward it, but the darkness swallowed it up, leaving only the pounding of the rain and the steady knocking. I began murmuring to myself, quiet words to keep from losing my mind, trying to rationalize, trying to anchor myself to reality. "It's the storm," I whispered over and over, even as my voice shook, even as my gaze remained fixed on the warped, locked door. Hours felt like days, and every little sound, a branch snapping under its own weight, a shift of the boards, made my pulse spike. I could feel the air in the cabin thicken, as if the storm had carried something with it, something that didn't belong in the human world, something patient, waiting. When dawn finally broke, it came in pale, grey strips of light, slicing across the cabin floor. I hadn't slept. My muscles were stiff, My fingers raw from clutching the window frame. I pushed the door open just a little, the hinges groaning faintly, and looked back toward the hollow. There was nothing, just the remnants of the storm, fallen branches, the mud sucking at the edge of the cabin like it had swallowed hours from the night. My boots slipped as I stepped outside, and I took off down the muddy trail without a thought, heart hammering, breath coming in ragged bursts. As I reached the first curve in the path, I glanced back once, and my stomach dropped. The cabin door swung slightly on its hinges, slowly, deliberately, though no wind stirred. I blinked, hoping it was a trick of light, of my exhausted mind. But when I looked again, it was still moving, faint creaks echoing in the hollow, like a door exhaling after holding in a secret for decades. The memory of that night has stayed with me in ways I can't shake. Every time it rains heavily, I remember the feel of the mud pulling at my boots, the hollow pressing in around me, the knocking that didn't match the storm. I think about what might have been on the other side of that door, pressed close to the wood, patient and waiting. I tell myself it was a feral animal, some lost hiker, a trick of wind and exhaustion, but the sound of deliberate breathing in a quiet cabin, the measured knocks, those weren't ordinary. I can still hear them sometimes. In quiet moments, when the rain taps against the windows of my apartment or the hollow wind stirs the pines near my home, it's a sound that carries weight, a sound that reminds me how close the mountains hold their secrets, how easily a person can vanish into the folds of an old hollow and never return. Even as I drive through the foothills now, the forests seem different. Trees lean and bend as if they're watching, and shadows gather at the edges of my vision. I know, in some way I can't explain, that the cabin and whatever lingered there are still waiting for someone foolish enough to stumble through the mud and storms, drawn to the silence and solitude. I can't go back, and I never want to, but part of me wishes I could understand, wishes I could see what was behind that old door. And yet, I fear the answer more than the memory. It's the not knowing, the patient waiting, that sticks with me. Lingering like the weight of wet wood against the side of the cabin, like the hollow itself exhaling after a long, dark night. Every step I take in the mountains now, I feel watched, measured, and I keep my distance because some part of me remembers that door, swinging ever so slightly, and wonders what it would do if I had stayed a moment longer, if I had tried to sleep, if I had listened. Story 3. Flickering firelight in the hollow. I had been hiking for hours, following a narrow ridge that twisted and dropped into a hollow so deep it felt like the world had simply ended and the forest had swallowed everything beyond. I thought I was alone. No cars, no distant voices, nothing but the wind running through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch under my boots. I found a small clearing near a trickle of a creek and decided to set up camp, eager to rest before nightfall. The sun was low, fading behind the ridges, and the air had that cold bite that creeps into your bones even before the wind fully picks up. I pitched my tent and gathered firewood, humming quietly to myself, trying to shake the sense of isolation that pressed in, heavy and almost suffocating. That's when I saw it. A flicker of firelight dancing at the edge of the tree line. At first I thought it was some lingering sunlight, reflections off the bark, but no, this was orange and warm, a glow that shouldn't have been there, flickering with deliberate rhythm, as if someone had lit it just beyond the trees. I froze, heart thudding, staring as the flames cast long, unnatural shadows that seemed too tall, too deliberate, stretching across the forest floor like they had a mind of their own. I approached slowly, careful not to make a sound, but as I got closer the fire vanished, leaving only wet leaves and the whisper of the wind. I blinked, thinking I must be exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks after the long hike. I tried to ignore it and return to setting up the campfire I actually intended to use, but the feeling lingered. like the hollow itself was aware of me, aware I had noticed something that should not exist. Night fell in an unsettling hurry, and I sat by my own small, trembling fire, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. But the flickering light returned, always at the edge of my vision, just out of reach, never staying long enough to confirm it was real. Every time I thought I had ignored it, it would appear again, teasing, taunting me from the trees, its glow reflecting on the damp undergrowth. I tried to chalk it up to exhaustion, to shadows dancing in the wind, but that explanation felt hollow, weak. It was a fire, yes, but it moved in ways that no ordinary flame should, jumping, fading, then igniting again when I wasn't looking. I began noticing something else. Footprints in the soft earth around my tent, small, irregular, not human, not any animal I could identify. They circled my camp, crossing and recrossing, vanishing as if they had never been, only to appear again in the morning, imprinted in the dew. Each discovery tightened the knot in my stomach. I tried sleeping, but every snap of a branch outside, every rustle in the leaves, made me bolt upright, straining for shapes that I could never see, shapes that seemed to study me as much as I studied them. By the second night, I was obsessed with tracking the fire. I would leave the tent for only a moment, trying to approach the glow, but each time I did, it would vanish, always just out of reach, always just beyond the last tree. I started noticing patterns, how the shadows shifted, how the air seemed to hold, how the cold pressed in heavier near the flickering light. It was as if the flames were aware of me, adjusting, moving just enough to keep themselves unseen, yet visible enough to ensure I noticed them. The forest around me felt alive in a way that was subtle and insidious, breathing in and out, watching, waiting. I began to realize that I wasn't just being watched at random, I was being studied. Someone, or something, was learning my habits. When I rose to fetch water, the fire would vanish. When I returned, it would appear again. I would light my own fire, and the flickering flame would persist beyond my reach, mocking me, teaching me without ever revealing itself fully. The nights grew longer, each one stretching into hours of half-consciousness, listening to the forest for clues, straining to identify the shape of the impossible. Sleep was impossible. Exhaustion dulled my limbs, but it could not silence the awareness that the hollow held secrets, and that those secrets were aware of me. Every time I blinked, I half expected to see flames reflected in the darkness behind the trees, a reminder that I was never truly alone. Footsteps or no, the impression of being followed persisted in the spaces between sounds, the sudden rustle of leaves, the shadow that fell just a little wrong, the flicker of light that belonged to nothing I could name. I found myself whispering to the flames, pleading for explanation, praying for reason, but the fire never answered, only the wind and the hollow itself, breathing softly and deliberately around me. On the final night, I made a decision. I could not stay any longer. The forest had begun to press against me in ways I could not ignore. The flickering fire had taught me its lesson, and I knew that lingering would be a mistake I could not recover from. I packed in silence, moving carefully, glancing constantly over my shoulder. The footprints around my tent remained, as if they had been waiting for me, guiding me, warning me. The forest seemed quiet, but I could still feel the presence in the air, subtle and unrelenting, just at the edge of perception. I kept my pace steady, boots sinking into mud softened by the rain, each step taking me further from the hollow, but never from the memory of those impossible flames. I dared not look back until I had almost reached the rise that led to the main trail. Then, in a sliver of moonlight, I glimpsed the flicker, dancing just at the tree line, vanishing as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind the faint smell of smoke and something else. Something ancient and watchful. I didn't speak of it for days. Even now, the memory lingers, the way the flames moved, the subtle cruelty of the shadows they cast, the way the hollow seemed to study me without ever revealing itself fully. It was real, I know, that much. I touched the footprints, traced them in the dirt, felt the hollow's pulse in the soles of my boots, and yet there is no explanation, no resolution, only the persistence of memory. Sometimes, late at night, I can still see the flickering light in my peripheral vision, dancing at the edges of the room as though the hollow itself has followed me, leaving a trace in the corners of my eyes. The forest did not want to be found, and it did not want me to leave unmarked. It was patient and watchful, and I carry that patience with me, uneasy and alert in every quiet moment. The hollow does not end, not truly. It is there, always, in memory, in the whisper of wind, in the flicker of light that refuses to belong anywhere. I can't explain it. I can't fully rationalize it, and I suspect I never will. The fire, the footprints, the sense of being measured, these are gifts and warnings all at once, and they stay with me, waiting, patient, like the hollow itself, always watching, always learning. Story 4. The Trail That Led Nowhere. I had been hiking for hours, venturing deeper into the mountains than I'd ever dared before, following a trail that gradually thinned until it was barely visible through the undergrowth. The sunlight struggled to filter through the dense canopy, and the air smelled of wet earth and moss, heavy and still. The trail curved around thick roots and fallen branches, winding in a way that seemed almost deliberate, like someone had mapped it to confuse the uninvited. Curiosity pulled me forward, my boots sinking into damp soil, the rhythm of my steps broken by roots and rocks hidden beneath the leaf litter. I told myself I was prepared, that I had enough food and water, and that the isolation was part of the appeal. But even as I pushed on, a knot of unease began to grow in my stomach, a subtle tightening that I couldn't shake. The forest felt different here, somehow, as if it was waiting, watching, breathing softly around me. Hours passed, and I became aware that the trail was no longer familiar. Every turn seemed to mirror another I had taken before. The trees shifted slightly, their shapes bending in ways that made the trail feel shorter or longer depending on the angle I took. Eventually, I realized something was wrong. I had arrived back at the same moss-covered rock I'd passed hours earlier. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at it in disbelief. I had marked the rock with a small scratch, something I do to keep track of my path, and yet the scratch was gone. The forest around me seemed subtly different as well. Shadows fell oddly across the trunks. Roots and underbrush rearranged themselves, and the air had grown heavier, dampening my breath and pressing against my chest. My skin crawled with a sense I can only describe as being observed, though I couldn't see anyone or anything there. I tried to follow the main path out, retracing my steps with more care, marking trees with ribbons I had in my pack, but the forest refused to let me leave. Every turn seemed to lead me back to that same rock, back to the same eerie clearing, as though I was trapped in some slow, deliberate loop. I began to hear sounds, low murmurs drifting from the underbrush, guttural, almost syllabic, but not human. I froze, straining to listen, heart hammering. The voices were too deep to be birds, too irregular to be wind. They didn't speak words I could understand, yet I felt certain they were communicating, sharing knowledge I was not meant to hear. Every step I took brought a faint movement in the corner of my vision, a branch bending unnaturally, shadows shifting, the forest subtly rearranging itself around me. I walked faster, panic rising, but the trail twisted and curved in ways that seemed impossible, each turn bringing me back to familiar spots I had already passed. Night began to fall, and the shadows thickened, turning the forest into a living black maze. My flashlight did little to penetrate the gloom, catching only glimpses of branches, roots, and the occasional glint of moss. The murmuring grew louder, closer, echoing around the hollow spaces between trees. I stopped several times, pressing my back against a trunk, telling myself to breathe, trying to listen for any sign of the logging road I had originally planned to follow. But the forest offered nothing, only twisting shadows, whispering darkness, and the constant oppressive sense that I was being studied, measured, tested. Every snap of a twig underfoot made my stomach twist. Every rustle in the underbrush, every low groan seemed to follow me, always just out of reach, always impossible to locate. I began to wonder if I had crossed into some part of the mountains that was meant to remain hidden, a section of woods so old and patient that it could bend paths and time itself to trap the unwary. Hours passed, though it was hard to tell in the oppressive darkness. I stumbled over roots and stones, falling into the soft moss at one point, my hands scraping against rough bark as I pushed myself up. The murmurs never ceased. I felt them in my chest, low, vibrating, echoing through the hollow spaces of my mind. It was as if the forest itself was breathing, alive, a sentient presence with patience far beyond my understanding. I shouted into the shadows, hoping to scare something into revealing itself, but my voice was swallowed immediately, leaving only the murmur of wind, or something like wind, through the trees. I ran blindly at one point, only to arrive again at that same moss-covered rock, the forest rearranged yet familiar, indifferent to my panic. I tried to force myself to follow the creek I had noticed earlier, reasoning that water always leads somewhere, but even it twisted and curved strangely, the bank collapsing where it had seemed solid earlier, the stones rearranged as though someone, or something, had moved them. I realized then that the forest did not want me to leave. It did not move randomly or mechanically. It observed, it learned, and it adapted. Every sound I made, every step I took, seemed to echo in anticipation, shaping the paths I chose. I felt like prey, yet there was no predator I could see, only the heavy weight of observation pressing in from all sides. I could feel the trees leaning slightly, the shadows stretching long and low, bending toward me, testing me, measuring my fear. Hours bled into what felt like days, though I knew it was only the deep night. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, knowing the batteries were nearly dead. I stopped moving for a long while, pressed against the base of an oak, sweat running down my spine despite the chill in the air. I whispered reassurances to myself, names of roads, landmarks, anything to anchor me, but the forest ignored them. The murmurs had become indistinct, more like vibrations than sound, pulsing through the ground and air, echoing inside my skull. I realized I was exhausted, my muscles trembling, yet sleep felt impossible. To close my eyes was to invite the forest closer, to let it measure me completely in darkness. Finally, just as pale dawn began to seep through the canopy, I stumbled onto a faint logging road I had never seen before. Mud clung to my boots, and my clothes were soaked with sweat and rain, but I didn't care. I ran, feeling the asphalt under my feet, feeling the air of civilization, the faint hum of distant life. Behind me, the forest seemed impossibly still, but I could feel its gaze pressing in even then, patient, watching, every tree, every shadow. Every subtle movement in the undergrowth whispered that I had been measured, studied, and allowed to leave, but only by its own rules. I didn't look back until I had almost reached my car, parked at the end of the dirt track. The hollow was there, a dark scar in the mountains, and I knew I had never truly escaped. Even now, Weeks later, I dream of that hollow. I see the moss-covered rock, feel the twisting paths, and hear the murmurs that are neither wind nor animal. The forest seemed to breathe, a slow, deliberate pulse I carry in my chest. Every time I hike, I notice subtle shifts in the shadows, hear low groans in the underbrush, and wonder if I wandered too far again, if the hollow is watching, waiting, patient beyond reason. It taught me something I cannot name, something that will remain with me long after the mountains themselves have faded from sight. I don't know if it was some hidden part of the forest, a fragment of memory built into the earth, or something older and more aware than any human mind, but I know this. The paths there do not lead outward in the way we expect, and the forest never forgets who steps into its heart. The hollow has left its mark on me, subtle and deep, a patient, quiet weight that I carry through every quiet moment, every shadow that stretches a little too far, every rustle in the undergrowth. I will not return, yet a part of me always glances toward the mountains, toward the twisting trees and the moss-covered rock. And I wonder if it is still waiting, still watching, waiting for the next step into the trail that leads nowhere. Story 5. The Vanishing Campsite. I had returned to a clearing I thought I knew well, a spot I'd used once before on a solo hike through the mountains, where a small fire pit and flat ground had made for an easy night under the stars. I parked my old truck along the narrow dirt track, carrying my pack down the familiar slope, the forest thick around me but still feeling safe in its quiet, predictable way. The sun was low, spilling through the canopy in golden streaks, painting the undergrowth in soft light, and I felt the familiar pull of solitude that had drawn me back here. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and built the pit just as I had done months before, each movement comfortable, almost automatic. I even set aside the rocks in the same pattern I remembered, a small ritual of sorts. I could hear the wind through the pines and everything seemed as it should, until the light began to fade and a subtle shift slid across the clearing that I couldn't place. By nightfall, the change was undeniable. The fire pit I had built, stacked carefully with stones and dry wood, had vanished. The tent lay flattened, its fabric folded awkwardly, not how I had left it. My gear, sleeping bag, pack, small stove, was scattered, some items missing entirely, others in positions that made no sense. I stumbled over the flattened ground, reaching for something familiar, any point of reference, and my stomach tightened with fear. I had arrived at this exact spot. I knew it. I remembered the slope, the rocks, the trees that framed the clearing, and yet, now, it felt alien, warped, as if the forest itself had shifted overnight while I wasn't looking. I tried to steady myself, whispering aloud that it was just exhaustion, that I must have dreamed the first setup, but the evidence was there before my eyes, concrete and undeniable. Panicking, I tore ribbons from my pack and tied them to several trees, planning to retrace my steps if needed, to have some anchor in the confusing landscape. But every time I glanced back, even moments after tying them, the ribbons were gone. The trunks looked bare, as though they had never been marked. I moved slowly, checking every knot, every branch, but nothing remained. The forest pressed in around me in a way I hadn't noticed before. The wind carried strange, subtle murmurs, soft, deliberate rustles that suggested movement around me, yet nothing ever revealed itself. My hands shook as I fumbled with the scattered gear, my voice caught in my throat. Each snap of a twig, each brush of leaves in the wind set my heart racing. I tried to call out, to reason with the silence, but my words seemed to dissolve immediately, leaving only the cold weight of the woods around me. I moved cautiously through the clearing, every sense on edge. The ground beneath my boots felt wrong, too soft, too uneven, as if the earth itself had changed while I wasn't watching. Shadows stretched in impossible directions, and the familiar shapes of the surrounding trees warped in the dim light. Every step made me more aware of my vulnerability, the sense that I was no longer alone, that someone, or something, was watching, tracking my movements from the edges of perception. I thought I glimpsed figures at the tree line, fleeting shapes that vanished when I turned my head, but each time I focused, the clearing was empty again, silent except for the wind and the occasional creak of branches. Sleep was impossible. I stayed upright, circling the flattened tent, examining the scattered belongings, trying to understand what had happened, but no explanation presented itself. The night stretched on in a slow, almost painful crawl. I heard the faintest of rustles, like boots brushing against leaves, moving around the perimeter of the tent. I froze, my breath shallow, straining to catch any movement, any shape, but nothing emerged. No footsteps approached. No shadow crossed the firelight I had managed to coax from a small flint spark. It was as if presence existed only in sound, circling, observing, teasing me with the knowledge that I was being studied. I dared not move too quickly, for fear that sudden motion would invite notice, but at the same time, staying still felt equally dangerous, as though the forest was measuring my hesitation, my terror, counting my every second of vulnerability. At one point, I whispered my own name, trying to anchor myself, to remind myself I was human, still in control of some fragment of the situation. The wind carried my voice in broken waves, but the rustling persisted, steady and measured, always just beyond reach. The scattered gear, the absent ribbons, the flattened tent, they all contributed to a mounting panic that pressed at my chest, turning each breath into a labor. I circled the area again, desperate to find a fixed point, a landmark that would prove I had arrived here legitimately, that I was not losing my mind entirely. Yet every tree looked subtly shifted, every stone moved, every patch of moss rearranged in ways I couldn't rationalize. The forest felt patient, deliberate, and impossible to outwit. By the faintest hint of dawn, a strange stillness settled over the clearing. The wind had died, the rustling ceased, and the shadows softened into shapes I could almost trust again. I looked around and realized the clearing had returned to some semblance of normality. The tent upright, my scattered gear back in vaguely familiar arrangements, the fire pit appearing intact where it had originally been. Relief collided with disbelief. It was as though the night's events had never occurred, as though my terror had been imagined. I moved cautiously, checking each tree for ribbons, examining the earth for tracks, and though everything seemed normal, I noticed one detail that refused to reconcile. Muddy footprints led away from the clearing into the darkness, small and deliberate, disappearing between roots and shadows where the forest thickened. No human or animal I knew could have made them. They were too measured, too purposeful. I left the clearing quickly, stumbling down the familiar dirt track toward the main road, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Yet the memory of the vanished night followed me relentlessly. Every step on the soft earth reminded me of the unseen presence, the strange disappearance of objects, the patient, deliberate rustle of boots just beyond my sight. I tried to rationalize it. Exhaustion, stress, an overactive imagination. But deep down I knew that rationalization offered no true comfort. Something had moved through the clearing while I slept, or thought I slept, observing, testing, interacting with my memory of the place in ways that were impossible to explain. Even now the image lingers. I can close my eyes and see the flattened tent, hear the careful, deliberate steps around me, smell the damp earth and faint smoke from the fire pit that wasn't there. The clearing returns in quiet moments, reshaped and haunted, and I can almost feel the forest watching, waiting for the next time someone thinks they know it. The next time someone believes the land belongs to them, the footprints remain in my memory, leading into darkness, a reminder that some nights cannot be explained, some spaces do not exist in ways the mind can hold, and some forests are patient beyond human understanding, capable of vanishing not only the familiar, but the certainty of one's own experience. Story 6. Eyes in the mountain fog. The ridge was silent when I woke, wrapped in a fog so thick it felt almost physical, pressing against my skin and muffling the usual morning sounds of birds or wind in the pines. I had camped here before, many ridges lower, but something about this elevation made the air denser, heavier, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The mist rolled over the slopes in slow, undulating waves, and I had to strain to make out the contours of the ground beneath my boots. My small tent was damp with condensation, beads of water tracing lines down the fabric. I made coffee over the faint glow of a portable stove, each clink and hiss swallowed by the fog. At first, I told myself the ridge was simply quiet, the fog absorbing everything, creating that eerie sensation that the world had shrunk down to just me and the grey veil surrounding me. I noticed the eyes before anything else. Two bright, reflective pinpoints hovering in the mist, staring directly at me. At first I thought it was a deer or some mountain predator, but the way they held my gaze unnerved me. I froze, staring back, trying to track them, but they moved when I moved, maintaining the same distance, the same impossible alignment. I called out softly, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the muffled air, but no rustle, no reply, not even the sound of fleeing wildlife. Only the eyes remained, watching, patient and unblinking, until my stomach twisted with the creeping certainty that I was being studied. I packed up quickly, hands shaking, trying not to show my panic, but the fog made it difficult to orient myself. The eyes followed as I descended the slope, drifting along the edge of visibility, never fully advancing but never retreating either. I tried to move fast, calculating the angle of my steps, thinking that maybe if I doubled back or cut across the ridge they might lose interest, but the sensation remained, the same unbroken gaze, the sense that some presence was tethered to me, matching my pace, unseen yet undeniable. My breath came in shallow bursts, mist forming in clouds before me, and I could almost feel the weight of those eyes pressing through the fog, chilling me in ways that no cold mountain wind could. I stumbled into the trees eventually, the thick canopy finally cutting the fog down to a thin haze at the forest floor. Branches clawed at my sleeves, roots threatened to trip me, and every snap of wood underfoot made me tense, expecting the figure, or whatever it was, to finally emerge. The fog began to clear gradually as I lost elevation, the eyes vanishing as though swallowed by the thinning mist. Relief should have come with the lifting of the fog, but instead the sense of being watched lingered, haunting every peripheral shadow. I could feel it in the slight movements of the leaves, in the shifting pattern of sunlight through the branches, as if the ridge itself had imprinted that presence onto me, and it refused to release its claim. Even after reaching the road, after the familiar line of pines gave way to the open valley and the fog dissipated entirely, I could not shake the memory. At night, lying in my own bed, I see shapes in the corners of my room, quick flashes of reflective light that make my heart lurch. The ridge was empty, I tell myself, no human, no animal, yet something marked me there. The fog was not merely a veil over the mountain, it was a medium, a filter through which I first saw those eyes, and a conduit that left me with a certainty I cannot explain, that I was measured, observed, and left with the knowledge that some things in the mountains are patient, persistent, and impossible to confront directly. I do not return to that ridge. I tell myself the fog simply plays tricks with light and shadow, that my mind, tired and isolated, manufactured the eyes. But the memory is too vivid, the precision of the gaze too deliberate. Every time I hike higher into the Appalachians now, my eyes flick to the mists that cling to the ridges in the early morning, to the edges where shadow and fog merge, and I feel that same weight, that same observation pressing down from somewhere beyond sight. It is subtle, almost gentle, but unmistakable, a reminder that the ridge remembers, that it watches, and that the fog can carry more than just moisture. Even now, months later, I avoid camping alone at high elevation. When the fog rolls in during my hikes, I pause, staring through the grey haze, straining to see beyond the mist, to catch even a glimpse of the impossible. And though I never do, I can feel it lingering in my chest, a slow, quiet pressure, the echo of those unblinking eyes, patient and still, just out of reach. Story 7. The Creek That Whistled at Night. I'd chosen a small clearing beside a narrow creek, a place I'd passed many times but never camped. The water ran clear and cold, weaving through moss-covered rocks and fallen branches, and the sound alone drew me in, a quiet, constant murmur that made the forest feel alive yet safe. I set up my tent on a patch of dry earth just a few steps from the bank, arranging my pack and firewood carefully. The sun was dipping low, and the late afternoon light filtered through the trees in long, golden slants. I built a small fire, its warmth comforting against the chill that had begun to settle into the hollow, and as the flames crackled, I sank back on a log to watch the water. The creek gurgled over rocks, the sound soothing, meditative even, and I thought that this night would be like so many others I'd spent alone in the mountains, quiet, uneventful, a chance to rest and hear nothing but nature. As darkness crept in and the firelight flickered against the nearby trunks, I noticed the creek's sound begin to change. At first, it was subtle, a high-pitched tone threading through the normal rush of water. I tilted my head, trying to locate the source, but the sound was impossible to pinpoint. Then it sharpened, unmistakable now, a piercing whistle that almost resembled a scream, a human voice stretched and distorted. My stomach tightened, and I called out, thinking someone might be nearby. Someone playing a cruel trick, but the forest offered no reply, no rustle in the underbrush, no shifting shadow. Just the whistling, moving with the creek, echoing and bending around the trees in ways that made no sense. I stood, heart hammering, straining to track the sound upstream, following the sharp note as it weaved among the rocks and trees. Each step I took made the whistling adjust, as though it were aware of my movements, retreating when I advanced, drawing closer when I froze. The hair on my neck bristled, and the night air suddenly felt heavy, thickened by something I could not see. I moved cautiously along the bank, peering into the darkness, my flashlight cutting through the shadows in thin beams, catching only trees and water, nothing else. The sound was impossible, yet I could feel its rhythm, its deliberate motion, as though the creek itself had grown aware, or that someone, something, was mimicking the water with precise intention. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was tired, that the wind and rocks had combined to make a strange echo, that perhaps my mind was playing tricks. But the whistling persisted, sharper and higher each time I focused on it. I returned to my tent, attempting to anchor myself in routine, laying out my sleeping bag, checking the fire. But every time I tried to ignore the sound, it shifted, threading through the hollow in ways that made my blood run cold. The noise wasn't random, it had purpose. It moved upstream as I looked downstream, it darted around trees when I looked directly at the bank. I sat on the edge of the tent, knees pulled to my chest, and waited, frozen, listening as the whistling sliced through the quiet. Every attempt to investigate was met with sudden silence. The moment I stepped closer, the sound stopped, leaving a void that pressed in, heavy and unnerving. The absence of sound became a weight, a presence in itself, more suffocating than the sharp tone that had preceded it. I circled the campsite, every shadow suspect, every rustle in the brush making me jump, expecting the whistling to resume behind me, close enough to hear breathing or movement that belonged to a living being. Nothing appeared. The forest, the creek, the night, they were still, almost impossibly still, yet I could feel eyes, attention, focused on my movements. I realized with a creeping dread that the sound was a lure, an instrument of awareness, and I was under scrutiny, measured by something I could not confront. Hours stretched endlessly, the night deepening into something static, unyielding. I attempted to sleep, curling in my bag beside the fire, but every snap of a branch, every sudden movement in the mist above the creek made my pulse spike. The whistling returned intermittently, high and sudden, travelling along the water, cutting through the fog that had rolled in from the hollow's upper reaches. I could not locate it definitively. I tried to shout, to call for help, but the noise was swallowed instantly, leaving nothing but the oppressive, watchful silence that followed each note. My chest tightened, my mind cycling between rational explanations and the undeniable sensation that I was being studied. By the faintest hint of dawn, the whistling faded, leaving only the familiar murmur of the creek, ordinary now, as if nothing had happened. The forest lightened slowly, illuminating rocks, trees, and roots in ways I could recognize. Yet my body remained tense, my senses alert, convinced that the night's events were not gone, merely waiting. I packed my gear with trembling hands, constantly glancing back at the creek, half expecting to see some figure, some impossible presence tracking my movements along the bank, but the water ran as it should, rocks glinting wet in the rising sun, the sound normal and soothing once again. I left the holler as quickly as possible, descending along the familiar trail, the events of the night replaying relentlessly in my mind. Even in daylight, the memory of the whistling persisted, high and deliberate, impossible to locate, yet undeniable. The mountains themselves seemed to carry the echo of it, faintly in the wind, in the rustle of leaves, in the soft patter of water over stones. I could not rationalize it entirely. The mind seeks closure, but closure never came. I told myself it had been an auditory illusion, some strange confluence of echoes and wind. But I knew in the depth of my chest that it had been something else, something aware, patient, watching, attuned to my presence. Even now, weeks later, I hear it in quiet moments, a high-pitched note in the distance, a sharp whistling that threads through running water or rustling trees. It is never loud, never immediate, but it exists, a lingering echo that makes my skin crawl and my pulse quicken. I know the creek holds a memory of that night, that it has been marked by something impossible to see but impossible to forget. I cannot return to that place, not willingly. Yet in every hike, every hollow, every ridge where water runs and mist gathers, I sense it again, patient, deliberate, as if waiting for the next solitary camper. The next set of ears to hear what I heard, the next set of eyes to feel its invisible gaze. Story 8. Shadows between the rock faces. I had chosen a small plateau at the base of a series of towering rock faces, the kind that rise abruptly from the forest floor, jagged and imposing, casting long shadows even in the fading light of late afternoon. I pitched my tent carefully on a flat patch of earth between outcroppings, the uneven ground softened by moss and fallen pine needles. I had admired these formations from the road many times, curious but cautious, and now, finally, I was close enough to trace their rugged contours, to run my hands along stone edges warmed by the sun. As the sun sank, the cliffs stretched shadows across the plateau, deepening into strange angles and shapes, abstract at first, then gradually more distinct. I shook off the chill creeping into my spine, blaming the dimming light and my own anticipation for the unease growing in my chest. By the time dusk fell fully, the shadows seemed to have gathered intent. Along the vertical surfaces of the rock, shapes appeared that were almost human, tall, lanky silhouettes that seemed to cling to the stone just beyond reach, impossible to define clearly. I told myself it was the fading light playing tricks, a combination of imagination and fatigue from the long hike. But as I moved around my tent, rearranging gear and stacking firewood, I noticed the shadows shifting in a deliberate manner, staying in positions that mirrored my own movements, tilting slightly as I leaned, stretching as I reached. My pulse quickened. I called out softly, a half laugh, half nervous murmur, but the air swallowed my voice. Nothing moved beyond the shadows, yet they felt aware, patient, waiting. Night arrived slowly, the plateau plunging into near complete darkness. Aside from the small circle of light around my fire, the wind picked up, whistling through the rock faces, and with it came faint voices, soft and murmuring, almost conversational, carried along the stone in a way that made them hard to locate. I froze, straining to hear, but the words were fragmented, tones rising and falling in patterns that suggested a dialogue yet never fully formed into language I could recognize. The shadows responded, stretching and bending subtly along the cliffs. Caught in the flicker of my firelight, their angles shifting as though listening along with me, measuring me against something I could not see. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to convince my mind that it was only the wind, only echoes bouncing unpredictably across the stone. But rational thought did little to calm the growing sense of surveillance pressing in from every side. Sleep was impossible. I sat near the fire, rocking slightly, listening as the murmurs rolled and fractured around the plateau. Every crack of a branch or distant rockfall made my stomach tighten, the shadows along the cliff seeming to lean closer with every sound. I considered moving deeper into the forest, seeking comfort in familiar trees. But the plateau was uneven, my tent and fire providing the only stable footing. I remained crouched, small and tense, feeling eyes in the darkness that weren't my own, awareness tracing me like a predator studying prey. Hours passed slowly, the murmuring voices rising and falling, the shadows twisting with uncanny deliberation. I spoke aloud occasionally, asking if anyone was there, laughing nervously, trying to break the tension. But the cliffs answered only with silence punctuated by the subtle movements of their dark forms. As dawn approached, the plateau was quiet again, the wind softening, the shadows blending into ordinary rock once more. I felt relief, though it was laced with lingering unease, a caution I could not explain. Packing my gear, I kept glancing at the cliffs, half expecting the shadows to reassemble, to follow me down the slope and into the trees. But nothing appeared. The stone seemed inert, unremarkable under the pink wash of early morning light. I descended along the narrow trail, alert to every sound, every flutter of leaves, every shape in the peripheral forest, aware that the sense of being watched had not left me. Even after reaching the road, even after the familiar shapes of the valley returned to view, the memory of the shadows remained vivid. Hills. I passed later in the drive seemed subtly animated, lines of trees and ridges echoing the forms I had seen along the cliffs. I felt the weight of presence everywhere I looked, a slow, deliberate attention that followed me long after I had left the plateau behind. I told myself it had been fatigue, the play of light and rock in low sun, but my own heartbeat betrayed the truth. The shadows had marked me, their patience lingering in my chest, a quiet reminder that the cliffs were not merely stone, and that some formations hold memory, intent, awareness, far beyond human comprehension. Now, when I hike in the Appalachians, I avoid ridges and cliffs that jut too sharply from the forest floor, especially in late afternoon or early evening when light and shadow can distort perception. But the memory persists, sometimes flickering across my mind unexpectedly. A dark silhouette along a distant cliff. A subtle bend in a tree that seems to mirror my posture, the low, almost whispered murmur of voices carried on the wind. It is impossible to explain fully, yet the experience remains etched in me, a quiet dread that grows each time I pass a rock face. The plateau itself remains empty, but I feel the presence of those watching shapes in every jagged cliff I see, patient, deliberate, waiting in the spaces between stone and shadow. Story 9. The Lonely Road to Nowhere. I had parked my car near the edge of a small hollow, miles from any main road, planning to hike a loop through the dense Appalachian forest and return before sunset. The trail had been quiet, winding through thick pines and moss-covered rocks, and I had enjoyed the solitude, the crisp air, the distant calls of birds that carried faintly through the hollow. By the time I realized how late it had become, I turned back toward the old dirt road that would lead me to the car. The sun was low, washing the sky in muted oranges and greys, and the forest seemed to deepen in shadow around me, swallowing paths I had passed easily earlier. As I walked, I noticed a figure far ahead, standing motionless in the middle of the road. My first thought was another hiker, perhaps returning the same way I was. I called out, voice carrying strangely in the quiet air, but the figure did not move or respond. I quickened my pace, trying to get closer, and as I drew near, it vanished. I froze, scanning the road and the edge of the woods, but there was nothing. No one, and the rustle of leaves in the gentle wind was the only sound. My stomach tightened, and I started walking again, faster this time, the feeling that someone, or something, was nearby pressing against my senses. The road narrowed, flanked on both sides by trees that leaned inward, branches intertwining above me, cutting off the last of the light. Shadows grew long and indistinct, and the sense of enclosure made the path feel like a tunnel. Then came the footsteps, light at first, echoing from just behind me, irregular but deliberate, like someone pacing. I stopped and turned quickly, shining my flashlight, but no one was there. Only the empty road, dust rising faintly with each of my steps, and the groan of distant trees in the wind. I walked faster, keeping my eyes on the ground ahead, trying to ignore the pressure that was building at the back of my mind. Each time I slowed, the footsteps seemed to quicken, falling in rhythm with my own, then pausing when I paused, resuming when I moved. I dared not call out. My voice felt too loud, too revealing, and I didn't want to give whatever was there a reason to show itself. The road twisted and dipped, and the shadows of the trees became more sinister, elongating across the dirt, stretching toward me with a life of their own. I tried to remember landmarks, familiar rocks, or a curve in the road, but everything seemed altered, unnaturally close, like the forest had shifted subtly to contain me. A flicker in the corner of my eye made me spin around, flashlight cutting arcs through the gloom, and there it was again, a shadow, faint and blurred at first, standing just beyond the tree line. I froze, breath caught in my throat. It didn't move, and yet I could feel the weight of its presence, the deliberate observation. When I blinked, it was gone, leaving only the whisper of wind through the leaves and the echo of footsteps that were no longer mine. Panic settled in my chest, slow and cold, and I broke into a run, dirt crunching under my boots, heart hammering so loudly I was certain it would give me away. The road seemed endless, each bend revealing nothing but more trees, more darkness, more shadows that shifted at the edge of perception. Every time I slowed to catch my breath, I heard it, the soft, uneven steps that mimicked mine, always just behind, never ahead, never caught in the light. My mind raced with explanations. Wild animals, exhaustion, the eerie echo of footsteps bouncing off the forest floor. But instinct told me this was something else. Something patient and deliberate. The trees pressed closer with every step, and the air felt thicker, damp with the smell of wet earth and something faintly metallic. I glimpsed my car far ahead, lights off, shadowed by surrounding trees, and I sprinted toward it, desperate for safety, for something recognizable. Every footfall echoed unnaturally, every snap of a twig behind me sending my pulse soaring. When I finally reached the driver's side, hands trembling, I slammed the door shut and locked it, panting, chest heaving. For a moment, the forest was silent. I exhaled sharply, trying to convince myself it was over, that I was safe, and that the road had simply played tricks on my senses. Then I saw it in the rearview mirror. A shadow, humanoid but wrong, features blurred and elongated, standing just beyond the edge of the car. I froze, unable to look away, feeling the same deliberate attention I had felt along the road. It did not move, did not breathe visibly, yet I could sense its awareness, the precise calculation in the way it regarded me. I reached to adjust the mirror, hoping to see nothing, but when I did, it was gone. The reflection was empty, the forest around me silent, and yet the weight of that gaze lingered, pressing on my mind and chest, as if it had left a mark I could not scrub away. I started the engine immediately, tires crunching gravel as I turned onto the main road, trying to put distance between myself and the hollow. Every hill, every bend in the asphalt, every passing tree seemed infused with the memory of that shadow, every flicker of sunlight through branches recalling the unnerving outline I had seen. My hands gripped the wheel tight, knuckles white, mind unable to release the sensation that the figure had followed me, that it had marked me, patient and persistent in ways I could not understand. Even after reaching the safety of a highway, after the forest had disappeared behind rolling fields and distant mountains, the memory of that night stayed with me. I avoid isolated roads now, especially in the late hours, and every time I drive past a lonely hollow or narrow dirt path, my chest tightens, and I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror for a shadow that may or may not exist. The hollow, the road, the forest, they remain empty. Yet I know the presence is real, and that for a brief time I was watched, measured, and released only when it had decided. Story 1. Whispering Pines at Dusk. I remember the day I left for the mountains like it was yesterday, though it feels heavier now. Weighted with the memory of what I can't explain. I'd been planning a solo camping trip for weeks, wanting to get away from the noise of town, the lights, the people who never stopped talking. I thought the isolation would be peaceful, restorative, but that day, I never could have imagined what awaited me among the pines. I parked my old pickup at the end of a rough dirt track and started hiking, the trail narrowing quickly until it was little more than a faint scar in the undergrowth. By late afternoon, I found a clearing bordered by thick pine trees, the ground littered with needles and broken branches. The air was heavy with the scent of sap and damp earth, and the wind had a sharp, almost musical whistle through the branches. I decided that would be the spot. I pitched my tent carefully, hammering the stakes into the soft soil, trying to keep my thoughts light, pretending the deepening shadows didn't stretch unnaturally across the clearing. As soon as the tent was up, the forest seemed quieter, as if it were holding its breath. The wind picked up, moving through the trees in slow, deliberate gusts. That's when I first noticed it. The whispers. At first, I blamed the wind, telling myself the sound was just the trees creaking together. But as the light dimmed and the sun sank behind the ridges, the whispers grew sharper, more distinct. I froze, straining to make sense of it. It wasn't random. It was my name, soft but deliberate, drifting across the branches. Aaron, It called over and over, curling through the pines in the sort of rhythm that made my chest tighten. I told myself it had to be my imagination. The forest was old, dense, and the quiet had a way of tricking the ears, but the whispers were too specific, too personal. I tried to ignore it, focusing on getting the firewood stacked and the stove ready. But every time I thought about sleep, the whispering returned, insistent, weaving through the shadows. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest darkened into a near solid black, broken only by the small circle of light from my lantern. I crawled into my sleeping bag early, thinking maybe I could convince myself it was all in my head, but then I noticed movement outside the tent. At first I thought it was the wind bending the branches, but no, these were shapes, long, low, shifting, moving between the trunks. They bent at angles that felt wrong, impossible. Every snap of a twig, every brush of leaves against each other made my heart pound, each sound sharper in the silence. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe, praying the darkness would remain at a distance. Then I heard it again, my name drawn out more slowly this time, almost deliberate, like someone testing the ground, feeling me out. I forced myself not to respond, not to scream, not to move. It was only when I dared a brief glance outside the mesh flap that I saw it. A crouched form just beyond the firelight, impossible to make out fully, watching. It vanished as soon as I focused on it, leaving only the whisper of the wind, carrying that familiar, terrifying name. I spent the rest of the night like that, listening, frozen, listening to the quiet stretch into hours. Every time I imagined sleep, every time my eyes began to close, I could feel it, something hovering just out of sight, moving slowly in the pines, keeping pace with me, keeping watch. I tried counting the trees, tried humming softly to convince myself that the shapes were tricks of the darkness, but the whispers didn't fade. They circled the clearing, circling my tent, rising and falling with the wind, never fully leaving me alone. I wanted to leave, to pack up in the dark and run down the trail, but fear made my body heavy, my hands trembling too much to even unzip the tent. Every small sound, an animal rustling, a branch snapping under its own weight, felt like a signal, a step taken deliberately in the dark. The forest had become something else, alive and patient, waiting for me to falter. Morning came, pale and grey, casting long, slanted beams through the pine trunks. I opened the tent flap, half expecting the shapes to still crouch there, but there was nothing. Just the clearing, empty, quiet, like the night had been a fevered dream. I shook, sweat cooling rapidly in the chill air, my heart still hammering. I packed slowly, my eyes darting to every shadow, every rustle in the wind. The whispers didn't come now, but the feeling of being followed stayed with me, lingering like a faint pressure on the back of my neck. I forced myself down the trail, each step crunching the needles underfoot, each glance over my shoulder confirming nothing was there. But I couldn't shake the sense that I had been watched, that the forest hadn't released me, only allowed me to leave. I remember the first sight of the logging road below the ridge, and the relief that hit me like a wave. Civilization, finally. Cars. The distant hum of life. But even as I reached the gravel, even as the mountains receded behind me, I could feel it, the eyes of the forest, patient, waiting. It was as though the shadows themselves had learned my rhythm, had memorized my voice. I tried telling myself it was just nerves, a trick of isolation, but even now, days later, I can hear it in quiet moments. A soft sigh of wind through trees, and I think I hear my name, drawn out just enough to make my stomach twist. I never went back to that ridge, never tried to retrace the trail, but the memory stays vivid, intrusive, like something reached out and touched the back of my mind and never let go. Every time I hike in the mountains now, I feel watched. the rustle of branches a constant reminder of that night. It wasn't a person, not entirely. It wasn't an animal. It was something in between, something patient and unseen, and I carry that knowledge like a weight I can't shake. I'll never forget the whispers, and I'll never forget the shapes bending in the darkness of the pines. They were there, waiting, and for all I know, they still are. Story 10. The Cabin Smoke That Never Burned. I had been hiking through a remote part of the Appalachians, a section of forest I had never explored before, where the trail narrowed into a barely discernible path, and the trees pressed in close enough to dull the sunlight. It was late afternoon when I crested a small rise and spotted a cabin across a clearing. It was old, weathered, and leaned slightly to one side, with boards warped by years of neglect. From its chimney, a thin wisp of smoke curled lazily into the sky, catching the last rays of sunlight. At first I thought someone must be living there, tending a fire, maybe a hunter or another hiker. But as I watched, a creeping unease settled in my chest. There were no lights inside, no movement at the windows, and the smoke seemed impossibly steady, rising without the flicker or shimmer that a real fire would make. I approached cautiously, stepping across the clearing, the grass wet with dew and muffling my footsteps. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the usual chatter of birds and rustling of small animals replaced by a dense stillness that pressed against my senses. The smoke continued to rise, curling in slow, deliberate spirals, and my unease deepened. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a hidden stove inside, fueled by some old coal or wood that burned without flames, but the air felt cold, damp, and lifeless. I slowed my approach, eyes fixed on the cabin, and then I heard it. The faint creak of wood from within, footsteps pacing the floorboards, a murmur so low I could barely make it out, like someone talking to themselves in a language I didn't know. My heartbeat quickened, and I crouched behind a nearby tree, peering at the cabin's windows. The movement continued, deliberate and rhythmic, the floorboards groaning under invisible weight. I strained to listen, catching a glimpse of a shadow passing behind the wall near the door, though when I blinked, there was nothing there. I told myself I must be imagining it, that the combination of isolation, exhaustion, and the uncanny smoke had played tricks on my mind. But reason did little to quell the growing panic. The smoke itself seemed almost alive, curling and twisting in ways that defied the wind, lingering as if it had a will of its own. I thought about retreating, about turning back to the trailhead, but curiosity and a subtle, instinctive fear pushed me closer. Each step I took made my stomach knot tighter, every snap of a twig underfoot sounding far louder than it should. The murmuring continued, voices low, unintelligible, sometimes rising into a tone almost like laughter, only to fall silent just as suddenly. I circled the cabin cautiously, searching for signs of entry, tracks, anything that would explain what I was witnessing. There were none, no footprints in the clearing, no disturbance of the earth, no indication that anyone had recently approached the cabin. The air smelled faintly of smoke, yet the wood inside was cold and damp, untouched by fire. I waited at a safe distance, rooted to the spot, eyes fixed on the curling smoke. The cabin seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, as though it had been waiting for me, or for anyone. The murmuring continued, pacing matching an invisible clock, footsteps never straying from their unseen path. I felt trapped in a timeless moment, where the forest and the clearing existed in a separate reality, one that did not adhere to the normal rules of light, air, or gravity. My mind raced, weighing escape against observation, the logical against the impossible. The smoke remained, constant, unwavering, a silent sentinel that refused to dissipate even as the wind shifted slightly and the sun sank lower behind the ridges. Eventually, I could no longer stand it. I turned and ran toward the trail, back through the dense forest, branches clawing at my jacket and face. My legs burned with exertion, breath ragged, but I dared not look back. The smoke remained in my peripheral vision, curling above the treetops, trailing me like a shadow. I reached the trailhead as twilight fell, and only then did I allow myself a moment to breathe, to glance over my shoulder. The cabin was obscured now by the growing darkness, but the smoke lingered, still rising steadily, impossible and unwavering. Weeks later, the memory stayed with me, gnawing quietly in the back of my mind. I thought about what I had seen and heard, replaying every detail, every movement, every unnatural bend in the smoke. There had been no signs of life, no evidence of a fire, no footprints to suggest anyone had been there. The cabin had been abandoned, left to decay for decades, yet something had lived inside it, or perhaps in it, that had not been human, not natural, and yet undeniable. I could not explain it logically, and the longer I tried, the more my unease deepened. It was as if the smoke itself had been a presence, patient, deliberate, observing silently, waiting for a witness. Even now, when I think of that hollow, the clearing, the crooked cabin, I feel the same knot of dread in my chest. The memory of that smoke curling impossibly into the sky follows me, a reminder that the forest holds corners and hollows that are not meant to be understood. I avoid that part of the mountains now, the roads and trails near the clearing, but I can still picture the steady, impossible rise of that curling smoke. A presence quietly existing where no one else could, watching, breathing, waiting for anyone foolish enough to come near.